Hello my lovelies and welcome to the Clueless Fangirl YouTube channel. I create content like this, lore videos, live streams and podcasts on Lord of the Ring or rather Tolkien's works on a weekly basis. If you want to follow me on social media, all links are in the description of this video. Enjoy! Hello my lovelies and welcome back to the timeline of Arda series. This time we're talking about the years of the trees. We've started with the Ainulindale and the years of the lamps that followed. Let's now go to the years of the trees, the next, let's say, time span before the First Age. This time span was also called the Bliss of Valinor, and you can imagine it's not all dark and gloomy, and with the light of the trees, an actual, let's say, happy and blissful time came over Arda, after a lot of destruction caused by Melkor that we learned of in earlier videos. It is indeed again a very long one and more so a very eventful one. It is basically the foundation of everything that plays out in the later ages. I already introduced the two trees and their concept of time in my last video, so what is happening at the start of this age? Let's talk about this now. We remember Melkor destroyed the two lamps and Arda once more fell into complete darkness. The Valar kind of retreated to Aman, to the other continent next to Middle-earth, to await the awakening of Ilúvatar's firstborn children, the elves, who they knew would come soon. So after Yavanna made the two trees, they are named Silmarillin and Telperion. At least Aman was illuminated once more. Middle-earth stayed dark. Well, there was a light of the stars Vardar did create before. For the first approximately 1,000 years, nothing really happened. Melkor was still in his fortress Utumno, and the Valar awaited the awakening of the elves while staying in Aman. Till finally, in the year 1050, the first 144 elves awoke in Fëanor, in the far east of Middle-earth. There was no sun when the elves awoke, just pure starlight. And if you have watched my First Age video, I was talking about how interesting it is that the elves awoke under starlight, and the men the moment the sun was rising for the first time in Middle-earth. Many times it is mentioned that the elves love the stars. They cherish them and they even have feasts celebrating their love for the stars. So there we can see a big difference between Ilúvatar's first and second born children already. And it kind of symbolizes, at least for me, both races. The stars are far, far away glimmer that seems to have been there since forever, beyond the concept of our time. The sun is very different. She seems powerful, she shines bright, just like a flame, and in the fashion she rises, she also sets. It seems the sun is more transient and perishes, although I obviously know she rises again every morning. Still, I feel both the stars and the sun describe and match Ilúvatar's children perfectly. It is also mentionable that Vardar, who created the stars, had another name given by the elves. She was Tintale and Elbereth, which means Star Queen. And she was actually the Valar that elves felt the most connected to. You might also remember a scene from the movies and the book when Frodo had the crystal from Galadriel that holds the light of Eärendil's star, and therefore the light of the two trees preserved in a Silmaril. You remember Eärendil had one of the last Silmarils. The light kind of guided, but also protected the hobbits from all evil. You remember Shelob, I hope? Also, the name the Valar gave the elves after they awoke was the Elder, and it originates from the word ele, which means stars. So Orome the Valar, who encountered them first in Cuivennen, basically named them after the stars. Another, and I promised last fact about the stars, is the star of Eärendil, which I just mentioned. We remember, and if you don't, check out my video on the first age. Actually the later age, but I did that video first. The Eärendil story is in there, that after defeating Morgoth, Eärendil and his starship Vingilort and one of the Silmarils were placed in the sky as a sign of hope for the remaining people of Middle-earth that helped defeating the evil. Tolkien explains that a group of the Edain, the first men that helped the elves and the Valar to defeat Morgoth and his armies, followed Eärendil's star, and they were led by the star to the newly created island of Númenor. And well, what can I say besides this sounds a lot like the Holy Three Kings following the star to Bethlehem, no? Oh well, he was Christian after all, so let's not talk about this. Stars were also later featured on house sigils, Fëanor and Durin, and as Celebrimbor the Ring Forger was the last living descendant of Fëanor and the one who helped building Moria, we see both star sigils on the gates of Moria, Fëanor's and Durin's. You might remember that scene from the movies with the Fellowship standing in front of that door. Speak, friend, and enter. I love these little hidden things that make you realize how connected and thought through this world actually is. Back to the awakening of the elves now. As I mentioned before, the firstborn of the firstborn were 144 elves, and they can be divided in 3 tribes: the Minya, Tatya, and Nelya. Amongst the 144, there were 14 Minya elves. You might know them under the name Vanya elves, or you might not. And their king, and actually the king of all elves, was Ingwe. The Vanya are the elves that we basically know the least of, and that showed up the least in all of the stories. They are portrayed as the fair elves. I promise I will make a standalone video on the houses of the elves, as this is definitely way too long and too important to cover in this video alone. Around this time, Melkor also discovered the elves, and unlike Orome, he did not show himself, but apparently captured and tortured them, and that was how the race of the orcs was actually created. Although this is not confirmed, as there were different versions Tolkien had in mind throughout his time. Let's stick to this one for now, because I think this is the most plausible one. And remember about Melkor's interest in creating things himself on his own. He kind of did that, and then he also didn't. Ilúvatar created all beings from nothing and filled them with life. The only thing Melkor was able to do and create was to corrupt living things and twist them and basically make them his slaves. So no, he did not really create the orcs. I always find that very important to know. Orome, after staying with the elves for a while, wanted to let the other Valar know of the coming of the firstborn. One of the reasons the Valar left Middle-earth under the dominion of Melkor was actually not to interfere with the coming of the elves. So he wanted to go back and make the Valar known that the elves were born. He returned a little while later to Middle-earth around 1086 with the offer of the Valar to welcome the elves in Valinor. But first they had to get rid of Melkor once and for all. The Valar learned that Melkor knew of the elves and what he started with the creation of the orcs, so they decided once again to make war on Melkor. In 1090, all Valar and the armies of Valinor came over to Middle-earth and fought the armies of the evil. They laid siege to Utumno, and finally Melkor was captured and chained with a chain Angainor. Sauron and some Balrogs, former Maya, corrupted by Melkor, could escape though. Melkor was then imprisoned in the halls of Mandos, in Aman, and remained there for 3 ages. And we all can imagine how much he must have hated that defeat, and he slowly began to realize this was all for the greater good of saving the elves from his influence. So watch out, Melkor and the elves, it will not particularly be a love story. In the year 1110, the 3 ambassadors and later kings of the elves, one from each tribe, Ingwe for the Vanya, Finwe for the Noldor, and Elwe, or Thingol, Lúthien's father as many might know him, for the Teleri. They went to Valinor and upon their return to Middle-earth convinced their king to journey to the west. They saw the 2 trees of Valinor, experienced the bliss and splendor, and fell in love with their gracious hosts, as the Valar did with Ilúvatar's firstborn. Not all elves were convinced, though, to journey west and leave the land they were born in. Some of the firstborn elves stayed even in Cuivennen. We never hear of them again, by the way, in the story. And amongst those who went on the journey, many settled along the way. You might have heard of the Sindar elves. Those were of the Teleri that choose to stay and settle in Beleriand and not go on the great journey west. Thranduil and Legolas were Sindar elves, for example. They are also called the Grey Elves, and you might have heard the term Dark Elf. That does not mean they are evil or anything, it just means they were not amongst those who did go to Aman and saw the light of the 2 trees. Those were the Light Elves, so that's the difference there. I do think this is a fantastic topic, but it's way too long of a story to tell in one video. Again, if you're interested in a video, let me know in the comments. I already have a list of 999 videos I need to make. So, the Great Journey West always reminds me of the migration period in Europe in the first millennium. And I'm not talking about the conquering aspect of it, but rather the aspect of settlements in uninhabited territories. European rulers made known they offer free land for settlers and gave them the task to secure their borders. Other times it was climate changes that forced people to move, or just the wish of a free existence, a new beginning, and their own land, just like the settlers that crossed the Atlantic and came to the New World. It's obviously not exactly that, but you can feel the wish of the elves to go west, but also the wish of the Noldor later to leave the west and settle in Middle-earth, found their own kingdoms in a vast land, and leave their mark in history. Especially the character of Galadriel is portrayed that way. Tolkien tells us she wants to found a kingdom of her own and rule there, and that she will do many centuries later. In 1130, the start to one of my personal favorite stories, it's the time Elwe or Thingol gets lost in the forest of Nan Elmoth and meets the Maya Melian in said forest. Both are the parents of Lúthien and therefore the ancestors of Arwen and Aragorn. And their stories are mirrored in many ways. How they met, how people from 2 different races fall in love and manage to overcome many obstacles. And it also mirrors Tolkien's own love story with his wife Edith. Not for nothing, their tombstones are engraved with Beren and Lúthien. I have a stream with John from John Webster Film on my channel about Beren and Lúthien, about the book and the story. And if you're interested in learning more about that, please check out that video. It's a really good discussion. Parts of the Teleri did not want to leave their king behind and stayed and settled in Beleriand. They became the elves of Doriath. More Teleri, they actually were the largest host of the elves that stayed in various places in Middle-earth. They settled there and founded their own kingdoms. Amongst the most well-known are maybe the Grey Haven. So you know this from the end of the books and the movies. It is where the elves and Frodo leave Middle-earth to journey west, actually. In the year 1133, the elves finally reached the western continent of Aman and are greeted by their hosts, the Valar. They build cities, and the city of Tirion becomes their capital. The High King of all elves is Ingwe of the Vanya elves, the fair elves, the firstborn of the firstborn. They are actually the ones that won't leave Aman again, except for a few of them and a host to capture Morgoth later in the story. In the year 1152, Thingol wakes from his trance in the forest, and he later marries Melian the Maya, who came to Middle-earth to serve the Valar Vanna and Este, to tend nature in Middle-earth and Beleriand, basically. And if you remember now that Maya, that is what Saruman, Sauron and Gandalf originally were, you know how powerful Melian must have been. Obviously, powers vary, but we learned later she was very gifted, and partly that gift went on to Lúthien, and now we can only speculate that her descendants, Arwen and Aragorn, must have had some of that power still in them generations later. In the year 1169, oh my god, all these numbers, a very important person and the creator of the Silmarils was born in Aman to the king of the Noldor, Finwë, and his wife Miriel. It was Fëanor, a highly questionable and three-dimensional character and very unique for an elf in Tolkien's Legendarium. For me, Fëanor was always that elf that most resembled a human, actually, in his choices and deeds and how he was portrayed, although he never really got to interact with the humans. I can't stress enough how different the elves of the Silmarillion are compared to the elves and their portrayal in the Lord of the Ring books. Fëanor is a topic for himself, and I've been talking about him in many videos before. It is important to know that his mother basically gave all her life energy birthing him. So you can imagine how powerful he must have been. And as always in Tolkien, that kind of power leads to doom and destruction. Nevertheless, he was an important figure of his time. We'll get to him later. In the year 1185, Finwë, Fëanor's father and king of the Noldor, weds after Miriel's death Indis, who was not an Noldor but from the Vanya. She was in fact the niece of Ingwe, High King of the Elves. She bore Finwë two sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin, the two stepbrothers of Fëanor. In the year 1200, back in Beleriand, Lúthien was born to Thingol and Melian. 100 years later, more important characters that have a role to play in the later ages were born as well. So many babies. Turgon, the son of Fingolfin and founder of Gondolin, and Finrod, son of Finarfin, Friends of Men and founder of Nargothrond. As well, a well-known female elf that even lived throughout all of the ages, and you probably know Galadriel. She was Finrod's only sister and therefore the daughter of Finarfin, the third-born son. I know this is highly confusing. First of all, they basically all have the same name, and I think what you can take out of this is the key players of the first and second age were mainly all born around the same time, and they were born in Aman, and therefore had, how Tolkien described it, the light of Aman within them. It kind of made them more powerful and probably more knowledgeable, well, not everyone, than other elves, and that didn't see the light of the two trees. In the year 1400, Melkor finally came back into the story. He asked for Mando's forgiveness and actually really was released from his prison because Mandos and the Valar couldn't imagine how someone would lie to them and not mean what they say. The concept of lies and deception wasn't used or really known in the blissful and peaceful Aman. thank God for Melkor, otherwise this would be a quite boring story, I guess. As soon as he was released, he befriended the Noldor and actually taught them craftsmanship and much more. But he also started to spread lies and started to see doubts in especially the Noldor, who, unlike the Vanya, were interested at first in what Melkor taught them and what he had to say. Still, there were elves that never trusted him. Galadriel was amongst them, and actually Fëanor as well. In the year 1450, Fëanor created the jewels of all jewels. The light of the two trees was in them. They were flawless, and they showed the light of the world before it was flawed, especially that of the elves, before kingslaying and all. There never has and never will be anything like them. And you can only guess how important they are to the story because the story is actually named after them. And it was said the fate of Arda was woven in the Silmarils. The War of the Jewels, the climax of which ended in the First Age, also refers to the three Silmarils. They were the catalyst for basically every important thing that happened in the First Age and Second Age, and maybe partly in the Third as well. Fun side note here, you remember Gimli asked Galadriel for her hair, and she freely gave them to him. Well, she was asked before by her step-uncle Fëanor. It is thought that the inspiration for the Silmarils came to Fëanor from the sight of Galadriel's shining silver gold hair. He begged her 3 times for a single strand of her hair, and every time Galadriel refused him. It seems like Galadriel could always see into others' hearts, and so she refused Fëanor, but she gave her hair to Gimli. Well, back to Melkor. He did not just tell the Noldor how to create jewels, but also how to create weapons. A novum in the peaceful Aman. Why would you need weapons there? But his lies seem to have worked, at least on Fëanor partly, and during a feast, Fëanor attacked his brother Fingolfin openly with a sword. For this deed, Fëanor was exiled from the city of Formenos by the Valar, and his father left with him. Here the real doom of the Noldor starts, and it was Fëanor who hated Morgoth actually the most, but he was also the one that fell for his lies. Maybe because he wanted to believe his stepbrother lusted after what was his as Finwë's firstborn son. As I said, he's portrayed as very prideful and, well, not the typical elf we know. In the year 1492, Aman changed completely. Melkor teamed up with Ungoliant, the mother of Shelob, who we get to know in the Third Age. She took the form of a giant spider, but like some other beings, we don't really know what she was. She came from the darkness itself, and maybe she was the incarnation of darkness, because that was what she brought over the world. Melkor offered to sate her hunger with whatever she wished, and if she would aid him, and that she did. Melkor killed the king of the Noldor, Finwë, stole the Silmarils, and then went with Ungoliant for the 2 trees. Ungoliant drank the life out of both trees and killed them with her poison. Aman fell into darkness, and the symbols of that age that gave this period its name were no longer. The Valar, Yavanna and Yenna wept for the trees and succeeded in reviving Telperion's last flower, and that later became the moon, and Laurelin's last fruit, that later became the sun. A very beautiful story how the sun and the moon were created, by the way, and I have that in my First Age and the Years of the Lamps video, explained a bit deeper. At the same time, Fëanor learned of his father's death by Melkor's hand, and of the theft of the Silmarils by the Dark Lord. He rebelled against the Valar that in his mind were the kin of Melkor, and he actually could convince many Noldor to follow him with the speech he gave. Again, power of word, very, very important here, and well, if he could do one thing, it was giving speeches. The doom or curse of the Noldor began here, and Fëanor took many Noldor who actually had no dealings with the Silmarils with him, and they now two were part of the curse and doom that would follow. A short side note here. After Melkor destroyed the two trees and before everyone learned that the Silmarils were stolen, the Valar asked Fëanor to give up the Silmarils, who now held the last remaining light of the trees in them. Fëanor refused to give up the Silmarils, and it's best to give you the quote from the book and explain why. Yavanna spoke before the Valar, saying, "The light of the trees has passed away, and lives now only in the Silmarils of Fëanor. Foresighted he was, even for those who are mightiest under Ilúvatar. There is some work that they may accomplish once, and once only. The light of the trees I brought into being, and within Ea I can do so never again. Yet, had I but a little of that light, I could recall life to the trees, ere their roots decay, and then our hurt should be healed, and the malice of Melkor be confounded." Fëanor then said, "For the less even as for the greater, there is some deed that he may accomplish, but once only. And in that deed his heart shall rest. It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, it shall break my heart, and I shall be slain first of all the elder in Aman. This thing I will not do of free will, but if the Valar will constrain me, then shall I know indeed that Melkor is of their kindred." So we learn he doesn't want to, and he probably can't give them up. I still get him to here, and I would understand that he wants to go after Morgoth to get revenge for his father's death. But the real hunt was for the Silmarils, and this is what actually makes me question his character. Listen to this. For Fëanor began to love the Silmarils with a greedy love, and grudged the sight of them to all save his father and his 7 sons. He seldom remembered now that the light within them was not his own. And I always felt and said, the Silmarils, maybe also the ring, they stand for greed and lust and war and death, and are probably evil, not by themselves. Yes, they are beautiful, and if you look at the thing itself, it's harmless. It's a harmless object. But what people do to get their hands on them is definitely not harmless. In 1495, Fëanor and his host arrives in Aqualonde, the swan haven of the Teleri elves, who lived there. He knew Morgoth did flee with the Silmarils back to Middle-earth, and there was only one land passage there in the north, the Helcaraxe. He didn't want to cross there, so he needed ships to get his host to Middle-earth. The Teleri were friends with an Noldor, but they refused, and the first kinslaying was the outcome of this. The Noldor were heavily armed, and the Teleri, who were higher in numbers but only armed with light bows, didn't really stand a chance, especially when the other groups of the Noldor, led by Fëanor's half-brothers, who after the slaying of their father went with Fëanor, Fingolfin and Fingon, not knowing what went down, and that Fëanor actually was the aggressor, stood on Fëanor's side, and almost all Teleri were slain. When the Valar learned of this horrible deed, Mandos put his doom upon the Noldor. And let's quote again. "Tears and number ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you, and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. On the house of Fëanor the wrath of the Valar leath from the west unto the uttermost east, and upon all that will follow them it shall be laid also. Their oaths shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. The evil end shall all things turn that they begin well, and by treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason shall this come to pass. The dispossessed shall they be forever." Fingon, the youngest of the 3 brothers, and his host turned back just after they heard that, and they turned their back on their brothers. And He left with his host and he got pardoned by the Valar. The other two brothers did not, and so they were part of Mando's doom now. One guilty of kinslaying, and one guilty of not believing his brother actually was capable of what just had happened, and maybe even scared to turn back now. I think this is the probably the larger reason. Finarfin's children, though, Galadriel, Finrod, Angrod, and Egnor, went with their uncle Fingolfin. Many ships of the Teleri did burn in the fight, and so there were not enough ships to sail them all at once to Middle-earth. Fëanor and his host went first, and what happened then again makes him the villain of the story in my eyes. After he reached Middle-earth, he did burn the ships and did not send them back to Aman to get his brother and his host to Middle-earth. He felt Fingon was popular, respected, and well loved amongst the Noldor, even his people, and he knew he would have to explain to Fingolfin what had happened, so he decided to leave him back in Aman. In the year 1479, Fingolfin's host, after understanding Fëanor did abandon them, but refusing to go back to Aman and ask the Valar for their pardon, went to Helcaraxë. It was an icy, sheer, endless wasteland and cost many Noldor their lives. Still, Fingolfin and his people made it through, and they finally arrived in Middle-earth. Back to a land that many of them did not know. Most of them were born in Aman, and there were not many that actually knew the land of their fathers. In the Middle-earth, Fëanor wanted to strike against Morgoth immediately. The first battle of the Noldor against Morgoth was fought under the stars, as the sun did not exist at that time. Therefore, it was called the Battle Under the Stars, the Dagor Nuin Gileath. Morgoth hoped to destroy the returning Noldor before they could establish themselves, and sent his forces through the pass of the Ered Wethrin. Although the orcs of Morgoth by far outnumbered the Noldor still empowered with the light of Valinor defeated them. Fëanor, in his arrogance, I can't really find another word for it, pursued the orcs to the gates of Angband, where Balrogs awaited him already. And well, you can guess what happened, cause yes, he was maybe the most powerful elf that ever existed, but he was no match for a Balrog, or let's say many Balrogs, and so he found his end by the hands of Gothmog, in front of his enemy's gates. Fëanor means fire, and the lord of the Balrogs, Gothmog, was a fire spirit, so basically the way he came into this world and the way his spirit was described, he also died. And I also want to point out that he did not even go to confront Morgoth, his real enemy, and he did not fulfill the oath of getting back the Silmarils and revenge his father. Others would achieve that, his brothers and their descendants. And that should say it all. Make your own mind about Fëanor and the doom of the Noldor. Finally, in the year 1500, Fingolfin reached Middle-earth, just to witness the sun arising, as this was now the time of men. The Valar did create the sun and moon, and the second-born children of Iluvatar entered the game. I have a 3-part video of the first age that followed if you want to know how the story continues, and I'm working on the second and third age video next, so we got all the timelines of Arda covered. Finally, it's a lot of work. So, thank you for listening, my lovelies. I hope you enjoyed it. I for sure did. And yeah, there's nothing more to say, I guess. Your clueless fangirl.